The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see it, hear it, we can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. So this morning, I'm going to continue my series on Prajnaparamita in Great Wisdom. This is part 4, I believe, and I'm going to talk about Reverend Master Jiyu and her training and women's training in general. Not that I have anything specific to teach women, but there's Reverend Master Jiyu taught in the context and form of being a woman, okay? And I think it's important that that not be forgotten, okay? And I'll talk some about that. And I'm also going to talk some about kind of historically why in Buddhism women have disappeared and why it's important that we don't allow that to happen again. Okay. So here's those of you who can't see here, Prajnaparamita. Okay, she was discovered, this statue, in the early 1800s in Java, in Indonesia. They think she was probably buried for 1,000 years, and they discovered her, the colonial archaeologists. For those of you who are viewing online, here's a smaller picture that you can see. Very beautiful. And the connection with Reverend Master Jiyu for me is that, for me, Reverend Master Jiyu was great wisdom. Okay. She may not have looked exactly like this, but she was still embodied great wisdom. So, why is it that I, as a man in a male body, am going to talk about women's training? There's a couple reasons. One is the fact that Reverend Master Jiyu was a woman. Okay, she emphasized again and again that the unborn, the unconditioned, is beyond all conditions: gender, sexual identity, race, ethnicity, whatever. And the unborn finds full expression in all of those forms. Okay, and because of my own personal history, I identify with a lot of women's issues. Okay, and I know that it's important to have images, it's important to have people, it's important to have teachings that are people like you. Okay, so it's a reassurance that I can do this too. Okay. The other reason is it's a it's a fulfillment of a vow that I made many years ago. I first learned of it from Reverend Master Koten, who's now the head of our order, and it's a vow that's connected with Achalanata, who's this fierce bodhisattva over here on the left, and it's a vow to support the training of women. Okay, it goes back to Dogen, to Keizan, also the Reverend Master Jiyu, every bodhisattva has general bodhisattva vows, like however innumerable beings may be, etc. But each bodhisattva or Buddha has specific vows as well. Okay, Samantabhadra has 10, the Medicine Buddha has 12, Amitabha has 48, I don't know how many other vows Achalanatha has, but this is one vow that's connected with him. Okay, and it's also it was Koho Zenji's vow, Brahmaster Jiyu's teacher in Japan. And so a lot of this talk is going to be also about the things that he did to make Brahmaster Jiyu's training possible, which has, we bear the wonderful fruit of that, okay? And it's a really good example of how just small things in training can have long-lasting consequences, for each of us, okay? We may not be the chief abbot of the head monastery in Japan, but each of us has an effect on the people around us, okay? And it's like throwing a stone into a pool of water. The ripples just keep spreading, okay? When I talk about supporting the training of women, I'm not talking about perceiving that, any woman needs my teaching, okay? Particularly no woman in our order. That would be very arrogant, and conceited to think that someone really needed my teaching, okay? So when I talk about support, it's more about encouragement, okay? It's also not about advocacy. Okay, I'm going to be an advocate for women's training. It's not that at all. That advocates can be very tiresome. Okay, I have to admit that I was one of the monks, one among many that tried to encourage us to develop scriptures that were gender inclusive or gender neutral. So when I talk about support, it's more about encouragement, and it's about trying to be aware of a bias that is pretty common in our culture, okay? And it's trying to be aware of that bias and the consequences on the people that I teach, and I hope may not have always accomplished it, but I try to be unbiased in this area, but also in other areas, okay? I hope I'm encouraging everyone, I looked up our rules of the order, and it has a rule about not discrimination, okay? There's about 12 different categories of people that, we specifically say we do not discriminate against, 12 different kinds of people, and it includes gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, ethnicity, former religious belief, so women are included in that. One of the ways that I, in my own kind of small way, tried to fulfill this vow was some years ago when I was the executive secretary of our order. The Abbey is a part of a larger order of monks and temples. And as the executive secretary, I was the record keeper, okay? And we keep records of monks, about when they're ordained, when they're transmitted, when they're certified as a teacher, who their teacher was, when they were born. Anyway, it's a number of different categories. I had to create a database, okay, in all these categories. And I realized there wasn't a category for gender, okay? And the insight, I can't say it was original to me. Someone somewhere along the line pointed it out to me, that unless you knew that Reverend Master Jiyu was a woman, looking at her name, Jiyu, you wouldn't know that she was a woman. Now, 100 years from now, you see the name Jiyu-Kennett. Who was that? You know, those of us who knew her personally were getting fewer every year, okay? And then I realized, well, this is also true for a number of the older women disciples who had Japanese names. You know, our abbess is Mei-an. Okay, there's Myoho and Mokugen and Ando and Jigen. And if you didn't know that these were women, you lose that aspect of their form. And I don't think that women have anything, I don't know that women have a monopoly on intuitive wisdom. I don't know that they have a monopoly on compassion. I know men who have, you know, great gobs of both. But there's something about, women's form that's important, that we remember that that particular form has the full potential of Buddhahood. And when I think about Prajnaparamita, for me, that's what this stands for. It represents the potential of women in training. And as I said, in history, this has gotten forgotten from time to time. And I feel it's important that we don't let that happen again. Now, you can say, we've got more modern technology, we've got internet, and all these things, photographs and videos. How could we possibly forget that Reverend Master Jiyu was a woman? Well, great civilizations with wonderful technology have crashed, and everything was lost. Okay, there was the great library and classical period in Alexandria in Egypt. In medieval India, there were 5 great Buddhist universities, all destroyed in the Muslim conquest of India. Nalanda was the greatest. At one point had 10,000 residents, all slaughtered and the place burned to the ground in one day. The Muslim armies thought it was a fort. And everything there was lost. Okay. Fortunately, a lot of that was transmitted to Tibet before that happened. But then we know what's happened in Tibet in our own lifetimes. A lot of that they have transmitted to the West, but a lot was lost. I've been reading some Tibetan history, and again, particular lineage or particular teaching say this teaching was lost. Okay? This document was lost. This book is no longer extant, is sometimes how they say it. The same thing happened when Buddhism went to China. Okay, Xuanzang, the great Buddhist pilgrim who went to India, who brought back all these scriptures. Well, the emperor at the time set up a translation bureau, and they did a lot of translation, but there were a lot of things that were put aside in a storeroom. And the next emperor was not a Buddhist and didn't care. So all of these things were lost. Okay. Now as we bring Buddhism to the West, we're translating those scriptures from China and Japan, but it's going to take at least 100 years. Okay, there's one group of scholars, 100 scholars, that started 45 years ago. It was sponsored by a Japanese businessman, and they say it's going to take us 100 years, 100 people working, for 100 years to translate all of the scriptures. Okay, and this is, I'm sure that there's Tibetan Buddhists who are doing the same, and with their scriptures. Now, I want to talk some about Koho Zenji and his support of Reverend Master Jiyu. Koho Zenji was the foremost scholar of Western civilization in Japan. He was in education as well as being a monk. And what comes through is that he wanted Buddhism to start over and have a fresh start. Okay. He saw from studying what was happening in Western civilization, sometimes called the emancipation of women. He saw the rising role of women, in our society. And he did a lot for women in Japan as a part of this vow connected with Chanata. He built a girls' school, he built a nursing school. He did all sorts of things in connection with Reverend Master to see that Buddhism going forward had a place for women. Okay. He invited Reverend Master Jiyu to come to Japan and be his personal disciple. Didn't know her from Adam or Eve. Okay. He was doing a lecture tour and she was organizing his talks in England. And he was conversing with her and learned that she was interested in being a Buddhist priest, and she wasn't seeing any opportunities there in England. He said, well, why don't you come to Japan and be my disciple? And she took him at his word. If you've ever read that little book on Soto Zen that we have in the guest house, there are facsimiles of the letters that he wrote to her inviting her to come. Okay. And he did all sorts of things to make it possible for her to be there. She was the only woman in a monastery of 150 men. Okay. Koho Zenji had his hands full. You read The Wild White Goose, and sometimes you can have the impression that all the men in the monastery were against her, and that wasn't the case. It's just there were a few people in very influential positions who had problems with a woman being in the temple. Okay. Women played a very traditional role in Japanese society. There was also the fact that she was a foreigner. Okay. There was still, this was in the 60s, there was still enormous resentment about the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. Okay. Probably most of the people there had relatives who died as a result. Reverend Master G would try to explain, but I was the British, I wasn't an American. It wasn't my country who did this, but it's the thing that happens when one race looks at another. The people in that other race, they all look alike. Okay, so she was a Westerner, white Westerner. Okay, so there was this racial prejudice there. There was also resentment. We sometimes forget that the Western armies occupied Japan. Okay, MacArthur, led the army, but then we occupied the country, and we instituted all these various laws, made them change their constitution. But the other thing that the Western powers did was they punished the Buddhist churches because they felt the Buddhist churches had collaborated in the war in support of the emperor. So they confiscated a lot of their financial holdings, a lot of their land, which was how the temples, a lot of their financial support came from the land. So there was a resentment about that as well. There was also a very common prejudice. I've encountered this myself. That Buddhism is too profound for Westerners to understand. Okay, it's just too profound. Okay, we don't really have the capacity to understand the Buddha Dharma. Yeah? So she was encountering, that as well. But Kozenji, he saw her potential. There's something about great masters, sometimes they can see something in a person and can recognize their potential and what that person is capable of doing. Okay? And I believe that's what Kozenji saw in Reverend Master. And she fulfilled his purpose. She talks about, she begged him to go to women's temple. And he said, no, they'll say I made it too easy for you. Okay? He insisted that she get the finest education and training possible because he really wanted her to take Buddhism to the West, okay, and start over. There's an analogy in Zen's Eternal Life. It's kind of quaint and probably politically incorrect nowadays, but the example of a bride in a white dress going to a new country and taking on the colors of the new country. As I said, it's kind of quaint, but the idea was that Buddhism could start over, could leave a lot of the baggage behind, and in particular to make it possible for women to fulfill their potential. And again, it was part of this vow connected with Chalnata that Kozenji was trying to fulfill. He did a number of other things. He continually had to wrestle with the senior officers of the temple. Okay, in the Wild White Goose, I read it, Reverend Master Yu's diaries. I read it every few years because I find all sorts of things. Go, oh, I didn't remember that, or I go, oh, that's where I learned that. But one way to read it is to read it from, okay, what is Kozenji doing in order to make it possible for her to be there? And one example was that there was a ceremony and whoever was in charge forgot to include her. Okay. Whether that was intentional, I don't know. But Kozenji heard about it. He made them set the whole thing up again and had her do the ceremony because it was necessary for her to do that ceremony to progress and do her certification. Okay. Another thing he did that Master Yu described it, he used her as a battering ram to open the doors for Japanese women in the Soto Zen church, okay? Because she could do things that Japanese women couldn't do just because of the cultural expectations and restraints. Okay, so he used her as she said, a battering ram. Well, you have a great master. Sometimes they ask great things of you. This is not to diminish the enormous work and struggle that the Soto Zen women monks did themselves in order to get accreditation. Kozuji was working probably behind the scenes. So this is something you're not going to find in the history books. But he had enough influence and power that he could make some things happen with Reverend Master Jiyu that at least loosened things up for other women in the Soto Zen church. Another thing he did that we, enjoy the fruit of, he insisted that all the scriptures be in English. Okay? Again, he didn't buy into this prejudice that Westerners couldn't understand the Dharma. He got her the best translators in the temple to work with. He checked all of her translations himself to make sure that they were on the mark. And something that's not always generally known, her translations of Dogen that appeared in Zidi's Eternal Life, the first edition was called Selling Water by the River. Those were among the first translations of Dogen that were available for English-speaking people. Okay? And we still use them. Another thing he did was after her, what we call a kensho, kind of an initial realization, he sent her to the most prominent monk in all of Japan, Zen monk, Soto Zen monk, an old monk called Sabuki Kodo. Okay? And I don't know that Sabuki Kodo was the patriarch. In Japan, there's one monk that's the patriarch. I'm not sure if he was the patriarch, but he was definitely the most respected Soto Zen and master in the whole country. And she sent her to him to verify her kensho, so nobody could question it. Okay, Sabuki Kodo didn't have his own temple. He spent his whole life just teaching meditation, going from place to place, meditation group to meditation group, teaching people meditation. Okay, he was called Homeless Kodo. And some of his direct disciples, there are also books. There's Uchiyama Roshi was one of his direct disciples. Shohaku Okumura was Uchiyama's disciples, who's done a number of translations of Dogen. So Sabuki Kodo was a very important person. He had also been Kozenji's master. Okay, so it was like, I'm going to send my kid to you to make sure I've done a good job. And Koho, this is described in the Wild White Goose, and Sabuki Kodo said, I see and I am pleased. Okay, so again, Kozenji did all these things to make Reverend Master Jiu's training possible, and we sit here as a result of that. When we do the founder ceremony every year for Koho Zenji, it's traditional when you found a temple, you're not conceited enough to found it in your own name. You found it in your master's name. And so when we do, and it's traditional to do the every year Founders Festival, and we do that every year. It's usually part of our Sadaki retreat. It's usually on November 1st, or around there. And so when we do that ceremony, it's not just rote, it's not just custom. It's because this man did so much to make it possible for us to be here. Okay? It's an expression of our gratitude. Okay, let's see if there's anything else I want to say about Koho Zenji. One of the things he said, and I think this is relevant, is that he said, religion is easy to change. Custom is hard to change. Okay? And whatever bias there is against women or other minorities or so forth, that's a social convention. That's a custom. And it doesn't have anything to do with the actual religion or spirituality. Dogen, he's still, Reverend Master Ji may have founded our order and our temple, but Dogen's still the founder of Soto Zen. Okay, he was unequivocal that women had the Buddha nature and had the potential for realization. Okay? There's, in his masterwork, the Shobo Genzo, there's a chapter called probably get the Japanese, Raihai Tokuzui or something, but it's about bowing to those who have attained the marrow of the way. And he gives examples of women who had realized the way. He goes this far: you bow to an animal if it teaches you the Dharma. He's not equating animals with women, but he's really honing in on the prejudices of his monks. Okay? And there's a postscript to the chapter where it becomes pretty obvious they didn't get the point, and he had to make the point again. Okay. Because Dogen did that, and the founder of our teacher tradition, regardless of how well or not that's been fulfilled over the centuries, okay, we still have that as part of our founding principles. And now we have the chance to fulfill what Dogen intended. That's pretty remarkable, okay? Took from 1200 to 800 years, okay? But at least now we've done it, okay? And it's important to keep that going. So now I want to talk a little bit. Well, we know the Buddha had female disciples. What happened to the female disciples? What happened to the women? Why is it something that it took 2,500 years for us to have a situation now where the women can have not only just their potential recognized, but hold positions of responsibility? Okay. I was talking about the struggle of the Soto Zen. It's actually, they're sometimes referred to as nuns, but they're not really nuns in a Christian sense because they're full priests. It's not like Catholic nuns, they're full priests. Up until 1940, the women could not ordain disciples. They could not take disciples and teach them. Okay? up until 1940, okay, less than 100 years ago. And this was part of the women's, again, there's a book called Women Living Zen, which is all about their story. It's really just inspiring and how hard they had to work, and they never gave up. They just kept persisting. Again, one of the things, for instance, that Reverend Master Jiyu did was, one of her first disciples was a big burly American. We know, some of us probably know him, Reverend Mokurai. Okay, Reverend Mokurai probably saved her life because he took care of her when she was in her little temple and was so sick. She never forgot how grateful she was to him. And one of the things that, again, Reverend Master Jiyu taught us, and I've seen this echoed now in so many different Buddhist writings, is you never forget what people have done for you, and you always want to return the gratitude. So she never forgot the gratitude that she felt to him. And because he was her disciple, she went to register him as her disciples. And the registrar said, this is not possible. It is not possible for a woman to have a male disciple. It's just, no, no, we don't have a category for this. And Reverend Master said she had to wait the man out an hour and a half. She said she had to sit there and insist. Eventually she was successful. But again, that's the sort of thing she did that hadn't been done before. That again made, sitting here as a man, it's because she did that I now can have a master that was a woman. Okay? Just, these little things have ripples that just keep going. Okay? So what happened to the women? Again, sometimes they're called nuns, but the Sanskrit word is, the monks were called bhikshus, and the women are called bhikshuni. When you see N-I at the end of a word, it usually means a female whatever. So they weren't nuns in the sense that we think of Catholic nuns, okay? So where did they go? What happened? We know they were there, in the beginning. We have a few of their poems and writings that's called the Therigatha, okay? There's lists that the Buddha gives of important, this was the foremost female disciple in lecturing or understanding this, or in devotion, or he made all these lists. They were all the men who were foremost in this, and then here were all the women that were foremost in this. So we know they were there. We know they were quite accomplished. So what happened? There's a very, I find a quite wonderful book that one of our former monks in this, and it's called The Woman Who Raised the Buddha. Okay? And it's about Prajnapati. The Buddha's birth mother died a week after he was born, Queen Maya, and she's honored and praised, and we really give her all this kind of almost adulation. But it was Maya's sister, who was the other wife of King Sudanala, the Buddha's father, who actually raised him. Okay, and so this book is about all the things that Prajnapati did. And Prajnapati was the one who got the Buddha to ordain women. One of the things that this book brings out is more recent research about the events around the ordination of women, about events that around the life of the Buddha. Okay, we've all been raised on the story of the Buddha that's in the Pali canon, okay, the Theravadan tradition. But now we're beginning to get translations of comparable scriptures that were translated into Chinese. And the basic storyline is the same, not always, but there's nuances and subtleties that are different. Okay, so it can be useful to hear the story through different, what they call reciter lineages. Okay, the stories, the scriptures, they were passed down by word of mouth for 200 something years and then were written down. And every lineage, because it passes through a particular culture, has a particular take on these events that happened. Okay, and there's a wonderful German monk, his name is Analayo, he's a scholar monk, and he's done extensive research. He specializes in translating the early Pali scriptures, but also the early Chinese scriptures. He's been very helpful to the women who are trying to restore the Bhikshuni or Bhikkhuni lineages. And the woman who wrote this book on Mahapajapati draws on his research that brings out different aspects of these events around the ordination of women. Okay, this author also, she went and talked to people who had stories about the Buddha, who had stories about Mahapajapati, they had stories about the early disciples of the Buddhas, stories that had just been passed down word of mouth among the common people, stories that didn't make it into the established scriptures. They weren't written down and kind of authorized, this is the word of the Buddha. Okay, so there's this whole body of other information now that we have about the life of the Buddha, about the other people around the life of the Buddha. And so this author brings out, and it's based on Alayo's research, when Mahapajapati asked the Buddha to be ordained, okay, initially the Buddha said, please don't ask me that. Okay? Please don't put me in this position. Please don't ask me that. And this is in the Pali Canon too, but the Buddha from the get-go, he planned to ordain women. He said, my mission or my purpose will not be fulfilled until there are the four classes of Buddhists, male monks, female monks, women, lay people, and men, lay people. But events kind of forced his hand. Okay, what happened? This was only about 5 years into his, ministry. Was that his father died, King Shuddhodana, and Mahapajapati, who was his wife, the queen, all of a sudden she was a widow. And in the India, you really don't want to be a widow. You don't have anything. Okay. And then the other thing that happened was all of the young other men who were part of the Shakya tribe, they said, well, I think we're going to ordain too. We're going to become monks. And so they abandoned their wives. Right? So the women, there was Mahapajapati, there was, the king's harem, okay? And there were all these other women who all of a sudden were deserted. And apparently they had a little meditation group, from the time of the Buddha's first visit to Kapilavastu, okay? So they already had a familiarity with the Dharma. Apparently, Mahapajapati was a stream enterer. She had a first kensho, so she already had some accomplishment, okay? And so, they took matters into their own hands, cut off their hair, put on robes, and walked barefoot 150 miles to where the Buddha was and said, "Would you please ordain us?" And at first they said, "Oh, no, you can be lay people and just be waiting, train at home." And they said, "No, that's not good enough. No, we want to be full-fledged bhikshunis." Okay. Again, the Buddha was saying, "Please don't ask me that." But she asked him 3 times in Indian, because you could ask something 3 times, then you had to kind of give up. Okay. But the Buddha's attendant, Ananda, was present, and he thought, maybe there's a different way I can approach this. Right? Ananda was very popular with the women. He was very beautiful, and they really liked his teaching. There wasn't anything sexual. It's just that they really liked Ananda, and he was very sympathetic to women's concerns. He was a cousin of the Buddha, so again, he had been part of the Buddhist family, the original family. And so he asked the Buddha, "Well, can women be stream entrants? Can they have first kinshas?" And the Buddha had to say, "Well, yeah." "Can they attain the next stage?" And the Buddha had to say, "Yeah." And Amanda, "Well, can they become arahants, full realization?" And the Buddha had said, "Yeah." And so Amanda said, "Look, here's your foster mother. She raised you. Look at what she's done for you. Can't you ordain her?" And the Buddha, he said, "Okay, but I'm going to put conditions on it." Okay, and so he instituted what are sometimes called the Garu Dhammas, and so he put kind of 8 conditions that the women would have to fulfill in order to be bhikshunis. And from our modern day perspective, they just sound ridiculous. Okay, one of them was that a female monk had to, no matter how senior she was, she had to bow to a male monk who had been ordained only 1 day. Okay, so it really put women into a subservient position. And there were, it said there were 8 of these. But one of the things that Analayo, and this author brings out, is the Buddha's reluctance to ordain women and these conditions he put on it was his way of 2 things. One, how do I integrate these women into my Sangha when I have this whole bunch of young men bursting with sexuality? How do I, integrate these women? A lot of them, they're former wives or concubines. How do I put this all together so that it works? The Buddha was also, he was trying to find a way for acceptance of women mendicants in the Indian society of his day. It was not a popular decision. Okay, it was very unusual to have women mendicants, alms seekers. There was also concern for their safety. At that time, only 5 years into the Buddha's teaching life, the monks usually, just meditated out in the woods or the jungles. It was very dangerous, even for men. Wealthy patrons began to donate these parks and beautiful places for the monks which they turned into monasteries. It's interesting, you never read about any of these parks given for the women, okay? So the Buddha had these, legitimate concerns about how do I make this work in this society? How do I make the women a success given my conditions? Okay. Muhammad faced a similar situation. You read the story of Muhammad. He was very egalitarian in the beginning, but he had to compromise because he wanted to gain the support of a particular political faction that he needed in order for his teaching and group to survive. We're talking 2,500 years ago. Coming at this from our modern kind of liberal point of view, this sounds ridiculous. Yeah. But one way to look at the Buddha's response to the request for ordination is to see it as this is what he needed to do to make women a success in this society. Okay? And it worked. Okay? For at least 1,000 years, it worked. The problem, the modern problem is we don't have this problem in Soto Zen, thankfully, thanks to Dogen. We don't have to have women in a subservient position. We don't have to have women bow, to all the men. But in certain traditions, those rules have gotten passed on and are still kind of, if you will, on the books. And they're just, from our point of view, they're outdated and no longer necessary. And we're fortunate that we don't have to contend with that, okay? Enormously fortunate. Okay? Now, there were all these predictions that, well, if the Buddha ordained women, the Sangha would not last as long as it might have otherwise. Well, the fact is that it did survive, and it looks like that what the Buddha did made it work, at least for 1,000 years. But then, see, everything disappears. Okay, there's several things that happen. It's usually just said, well, the women's order died out. Okay, well, what does that mean? We know that there were still female monks 1,000 years later because Bodhidharma's master was a woman. Okay? Bodhidharma's the monk who took the Dharma from India to China. Okay? And his master was a great woman. Again, this is something that the knowledge of that we owe to Koho Zenji, because Koho Zenji told Reverend Master Jiyu that the women in our ancestral line, you find out who they are. Okay. And she had her hands full, so she asked Reverend Koten, who's quite a scholar, and he was her research assistant at the time, and he found women in our ancestral line. And one of them was, in the ancestral line, it's Hanya Tara, but the Sanskrit was Prajna Tara. We come back to Prajna Prajnaparamita. There's an interesting link there. So Prajnaparamita was a quite established female monk. So we know that there were women monks at that point, but there are no records. Okay. One thing is there's not a lot of records, period, because Indian civilization, they didn't tend to keep good historical records. Okay? It's not a judgment, that's just the spirit of their civilization, that they put the emphasis more on the lasting, eternal principle, okay, rather than on the human record of people doing this. So there weren't very many records, period. We know that then these great universities were founded around, starting at about 200 AD, but they were all for men, okay? So again, what happened to the women? We just don't know, okay? The other thing that started happening in Indian society is that the caste system became more and more rigid. Okay? At the time of the Buddha, apparently the caste system was still kind of just beginning to get going, and there was some flexibility. But there was a development in Indian society where those categories hardened, and you couldn't change, you couldn't get out of your caste. If you were born into that caste, that was it. The Buddha rebelled against that. He allowed people of different castes to become a part of his Sangha. Okay, it was very unusual. In some ways, almost, as problematic as letting women into the Sangha. But Indian society hardened, and this is my own theory, and I wonder, why is there no research about this? But I suspect that the roles allowed to women hardened too. So the impetus of the society was against having these women running around loose without the oversight of men. It was probably quite threatening. Okay? And so I think the society probably hardened in that sense too. And as monks, as Bhikkhunis, you depend on the alms of the people around you to support you. And if the people around you didn't approve of women being monks, they didn't support them. Okay? There's another piece of this. The other thing that happened in Indian society, and as I said, Buddhism was dying out. Okay, two things happened. One is the emphasis became more and more on these monastic universities. Okay, which were very intellectual. Okay, one of our ancestors is Nagarjuna, and if you ever read his writings on emptiness, it's just, what? He's very much intellectual. Remember, women probably didn't have much education, okay? They couldn't go to these universities. These universities were not supported by the common people. They were endowed by the royal families, okay? There was a movement in Hinduism called Bhakti Yoga, is a way of devotion. Okay, Buddhism was very much a part of popular Buddhism. But what happened is what we now call Hinduism. They started saying, "Oh, that's interesting. Why don't we start doing some of these things?" And so there was a resurgence of Indian religions, that because the Buddhist monks were probably all off here in this big university, there were their teachers who lived in their villages that were teaching more or less the same thing. Well, who are you going to support? Okay? So you had these several things happening in Indian society that by the time the Muslim army started invading India, there was no popular support for Buddhism. They didn't stand up for the Buddhists. Okay? And then everything was wiped out when these monastic universities were destroyed. So there was hardly anything left of Buddhism. Okay? And I suspect if the women were still around at that time, that's when they definitely came to an end. If they had survived that long, that was the end for them as well. Okay? So that's, it seems to be what happened to the women, at least in the Indian lineages. Buddhism was transmitted to Tibet, but only the novice ordination was transmitted to Tibet. Okay, it was transmitted to China, but in China you've got the Confucian values, which again have women in a very subservient position. And then into Japan, yes, the women's ordination was passed on, but the women were kind of shunted to one side, okay, which is still the case, okay, even though they now have the ability to move up in the ranks, okay, they're still on the outside of the major establishment. Okay. There's a famous woman, Roshi, called Ayayami? Is that right? Ayayami? She wrote a wonderful book called Zen Seeds. Okay, she's the abbess of what they call a convent. She's allowed to go to these meetings, monthly meetings of all the major Soto leaders, but she's one of 50. Okay, so the women are still kind of marginalized. And look what we have here. Isn't it amazing? It really is amazing. And it's all because people like Koho Shinji, did these things really for us, for the future, and what Reverend Master Jiyu did. And her troubles didn't stop when she came to the West. She was still a foreigner. Okay? She was still a woman. Okay? She was a foreigner not only in the fact that she was a Britisher and American, even though she became an American citizen. She was still the only Westerner in her generation of Japanese Zen masters in the West, and there was still prejudice about that. Okay, so she continued. Her koan was being a woman, and she told us, she said, my koan, when I went to Japan, I was a foreigner and I was a woman. And she said, my koan didn't go away, but I learned to train with it. Okay? And that's the lesson that she teaches us. No matter what our circumstances, we can train in those conditions. Okay? Whatever our karmic inheritance is, that actually is what our koan is, what we bring into this life to work on, our spiritual problem. We can train with that. Nothing hinders us, okay? We just have to keep coming back to meditation, and that's where we find our strength. Okay? The three treasures. Okay? The Buddha, or the Buddha within our own hearts, the Dharma, the teaching that the Buddha gave, but also which resonates in our own hearts. And we're fortunate to have the Sangha, people who support our training. That's one thing that Reverend Master Jiyu didn't have when she came to the West. And again, that's one of her great gifts, is she established the Sangha, fellow practitioners who can support each other, so that we had all three treasures. Okay? So I've probably gone on probably longer than I'm supposed to, and we've got a retreat starting this evening. Thank you for bearing patiently with me on this. I had planned to do this as kind of the last talk in this series, but as I said at the beginning, this series was not going to be linear, and it's going to be more like you're on the ocean in a boat and we're exploring different coastlines. Well, it came up as it's good to explore this coastline now. One of the things that also gave me real impetus to do this and not wait is that a few months ago I read a book that was by a prominent woman Zen teacher, and she was talking about all these things that, women were doing in the Zen tradition, and Reverend Master Jiyu was not even mentioned. And I just found that so shocking. I mean, it takes a lot I've seen a lot, but I was shocked. I said, she's already being disappeared. She's already being written out of the history books. Okay, so this again, it's where I'm into. Let us not forget her. Let us not forget that she trained in the form of a woman. What she did was magnificent, not because she was a woman, but she did it within the form of a woman. And this is so important we don't forget this. Okay, so I'll close there, and thank you all for listening. And I hope that we have an order, that we have a Sangha, that the potential of women will always be recognized and made, not just made use of, but encouraged. And not just women, but other people, okay? That we are open to differences. And my observation is that, at least in the West, in the Zen orders that are open to women tend to be more open to other groups that may have been marginalized or had less opportunities. So what Reverend Master Jiyu Koho Genji did for women, again, those ripples just keep spreading. They benefit other people as well. So let's not forget that Reverend Master Jiyu did so much for us, Koho Genji did so much for us, and keep, remembering the gratitude. Reverend Master Jiyu said that gratitude is the fifth of the four wisdoms. And she also said gratitude is the water that primes the pump of enlightenment. If you want enlightenment, you've got to put the water in the pump. You have to put the gratitude in there and pump. Gratitude. So let us never forget our gratitude. Thank you.